Dandadan episode 4 was easily the most ambitious and the most fun episode so far. Featuring a hefty amount of action, it was genuinely pleasing to look at. Let's talk about the visuals, the animation, the colors, the CGI, all of it. Make sure to subscribe. The episode was directed and storyboarded by Moko-chan, who, just like series director Fuga Yamashiro, is a new Science Saru exclusive name. I'm not all that familiar with his somewhat short resume. I'll watch Time Machine Blues at some point, I promise. Now, while I have covered the potential production problems that this show might run into, I do need to talk about a few additional things in that vein. Trust me, it's relevant. This show is messy. The staff lists clearly indicate that. Every single episode so far, without exception, has had large animation director and second key animator counts. Inevitably, the final product started to suffer. Episodes 1 and 2 were fine, but episode 3 showed visible cracks. The in-betweening had issues, the animation had its janky moments, be it the melt or the occasional poor drawing, and the compositing department had its mishaps. The uneven line filter on the characters literally disappeared on a couple of occasions. Of course, none of this makes Dandadan episode 3 badly animated, but stuff like this is usually indicative of bigger issues down the line. Still, episode 4 was glorious. Despite the messy staff list, it was fantastic. It opened up with a series of beautiful, detailed backgrounds. Loved the movement of the leaves. I think it's one of those motion filter things added on top of a static background. We then got some of that clever use of diegetic light sources. That's something I raved about in my previous video about the show. They selectively lit parts of the background, which allowed for this, admittedly, really good jump scare. The heavy texture work on Connie's mom hair looks uncanny and out of place, which is the whole idea. From this point on, the non-diegetic light kicks in. Where is this red light coming from? We don't know, that's why it's non-diegetic. It doesn't have a source. I talked about this in my previous video. Director Yamashiro in an interview said that each color represents something. Red is for anything related to Okarun/Turbo Granny, green is for Momo, blue for those aliens from episode 1, etc, etc. Also, it's worth mentioning that the characters were never static. The character acting wasn't earth-shattering, but the movement was there and the poses were energetic and fun. The shot compositions were interesting as well. Look at this shot. The low Dutch angle emphasizes the character placements and the length of the tunnel, and it's interesting to look at. Of course, by this point, the scenes are completely seeped in that red tone, and while I can see why it might come off as a bit much for some, I personally think it adds to the quirky, chaotic presentation. The first animation highlight was animated by Tetsuya Rikitoku, a rookie animator who got his start on studio-bind projects like Mushoku Tensei and Onimai. The shapes here are a lot more loose, with the hair and the highlights looking very flowy. The shading looks beautiful and Okarun's movement, despite being quick, stood out to me. Him getting overwhelmed by the wind and flailing his arms as he falls is a natural-looking action. This zoom is somewhat janky, the drawings are great, but the background-foreground sync is off. Although the lighting does help hide a lot of it. It doesn't look right. The characters look like they are gliding on the background. Funny thing is, the background in the original Genga was hand animated, but it was replaced with a static illustration in the final version, which is a shame. An animated background would have made this scene look a lot less stiff. Excellent drawings here. Again, the shapes are loose and exaggerated. Her eyelashes have these organic highlights which look great, and her eyebrows literally break, which I don't think is part of her design, but looks amazing. Beautiful morphing animation here. The three-tone shading looks so appealing. Love this shot. The layout is so complex. It's a Dutch angle shot, and on top of that, the background looks volumetric. You get a sense of distance and space. And of course, hand-drawn light flares, you love to see it. Usually, I'm not a fan of these make the background layer span to show the characters running shots. I don't think they work. It ends up looking like the characters are running in place, but in this particular case, the tunnel being never-ending is the whole point, so weirdly enough, it looks fine. Lots of hands and some passable morphing animation follows. I'm pretty sure this final drawing is part of the background. That is, it is a background component. This scene was animated by Kyohei Ebata, by the way, at least the layout was. I love this cut. This warped effect is fully hand animated and meant to resemble a changing camera FOV agree. Also, some decent foreshortening here. This cut could have used some additional in-betweening. The movement looks extremely stiff, but it's a fairly unimportant cut, so it's fine. There's something about the white highlights. They really pop out against the red tone. It's very pleasing to look at. The crab is CGI. It looks like CG will be a major component of the show, and in all honesty, I think the CG looks great. That's right, Mr. CG apologist thinks the CGI looks good. What a surprise. No, but seriously, the strong shades of red or blue or black help the models blend in, and on top of that, their frame rate is adjusted to match the 2D animation, a fairly common technique, but it does make a difference. Speaking of frame rates, the show often utilizes an intentionally lowered one. This shot, for example, is choppy, but it adds to the presentation, and I imagine it gives the in-between team a break. We then get another animation highlight, one animated by Momofuji, and we need to talk about him. Momofuji has been a major component of Dandadan as far as animation is concerned. He has worked on every single episode up until this point, and his output has been insane. Whether it's action or character acting, he can do it all. He is a cornerstone of this project. His work on episode 4 was all about exaggeration. First off, the background. The entire thing was hand animated, although the textures on the leaves added by the photography team didn't look the best in my opinion. The movement looks unnatural. They could have left the raw 2D animation alone. I think that would have looked better. Anyway, the way the background warps is so good. Does it make sense? No. Walls are solid and brittle. They can't stretch. That doesn't make sense, but guess what? It's animation, and in the world of animation, they can. Also, because of this warp, the animator couldn't simply draw a few frames, loop it, and call it a day. He had to animate the entire warp frame by frame. The character motion is exaggerated as well. You don't run like this, but the body language fits the tone of the show. Not all of it was exaggerated, of course. Okarun's body language here looks quite natural. In this shot, the characters are running, but the background movement is negligible, meaning you can't convey speed through relative motion. So then how do you convey speed? Through these flickering wind effects, of course. Overall, Momofuji's sequence was wonderful, one of the best from the episode. The sequence that followed was the most Masaki Yuasa built scene from this show so far, and it's about time really. These wobbly lines on the background and the loose shapes and lines on the characters look incredible. Also, lovely foreshortening. These drawings look so good. Their faces seen through Okarun's helicopter legs, a bizarre sentence by the way, turn into these lineless, wobbly drawings. This entire sequence was quite stylized and the Yuasa influence was evident. Moving on, there's something so cute about Momo's silly little face. One of those low-quality anime posts you see all over Instagram. The crab's appearance was accompanied by a large amount of debris animation. This shot was particularly impressive. Everything you see on screen here is hand-drawn. The house, the railings, the pole, all of it, and this entire background falls apart. That's an insane amount of stuff to animate. The debris animation is incredibly tense. I can only imagine the number of effect layers this scene contains. This shot is really cool. The background is 3D and the camera tracks the back of Okarun's head. It's fun to look at, isn't it? It's so dynamic. The cones of light were a nice addition. This cut employs that intentionally lowered frame rate which makes the movement feel heavy. Skipping ahead a bit, we get some crowd animation, which is always impressive. Yes, the movement is looped, but it's still so good. This shot was amazing. You have 5 to 6 characters and all of them move differently. One runs while the other jumps over a car. Also love this shot. The characters are silhouettes and the red glow from the phone is a source of contrast. This zoom looked quite solid as well. The zoom on the first guy is animated, meaning him going backwards is drawn frame by frame, while the rest of the crowd is simply moved backwards. This cut looked a bit stiff. I know it's supposed to look snappy, but I think it needs a few additional frames. It's too jumpy and quick. Some decent character acting then brings us to the highlight of the episode. Some crowd animation kicks it off, followed by a rotation that's too quick for us to notice any imperfections. The background here is almost completely blacked out with a literal spotlight on the main characters, so you know where to look. The build-up and release was perfect here. The pile of people inflates and stays stays that way for several frames, followed by a quick snappy release. Some extreme perspective work can be seen in this cut. The pose is so warped, you can barely see his shoulders, let alone the rest of his body. The crowd in these cuts is completely static, which is fine. Can you really blame them for not animating 78 people all the time? Come on. The sequence that follows is animated by Shun Miyakawa, and it's heavily stylized. The wobbly motion is intentional, even the layout had it. Miyakawa's entire sequence had this trippy, warped style of movement and timing, and since he did his own Genga for most of it, I think it's almost certainly intentional. As the characters soar through the air, a couple of hand-animated buildings fly by. In case you couldn't tell, this is the sequence. It lasts for a frame, but I love the three-tone shading on Okarun's hair. The shapes are so unique. This shot is insanely complicated. The background animation is absurd. That's two characters, two entire rows of buildings, the road in between, and a literal sea of people all animated on once. It's mind-blowing. The aforementioned wobbliness can be intentional, or it can be a case of a shot simply being too complex. I think and hope it's the former. The landing felt quite heavy as well. The layout for this cut was drawn by Miyakawa, but the second key animation was handled by Kaito Tomioka. The crab is then treated like a background. It's so large that it basically turns into a landscape. And speaking of background animation, they hand animated the zoom on this building, and it's not just the zoom, the perspective changes from a regular low angle shot to more of a 3-point perspective. Also, top-notch perspective work on Okarun. Look how warped his legs are. When you consider all of these components, the crab background, the building, and the characters, you get the full picture of just how complicated this cut is. This consistent style of background animation is then contrasted by this abstract style. You can vaguely make out that it's the city, but it doesn't really look like anything for the most part, which is not a bad thing, by the way. The sequence that follows was animated by the one and only Hironori Tanaka. It's not too over the top, but we did get that classic Tanaka line work, shading, and hair animation. Tanaka's mastery over line placement and shadows is unmatched. You can tell it's him from the shapes of the shadows alone. As we near the end, we get another highlight. This one was animated by Hayato Kurosaki, and the effects animation makes that obvious. We got those easily recognizable wind effects, and if that wasn't enough, here's that classic Hayato Kurosaki explosion. Those thick, dense shapes look so incredible. Kurosaki is a master of effects animation. That man can probably draw smoke in his sleep. This shot was needlessly complicated. Not only does her body disintegrate into effects, it actively changes perspective as she does. Some lively over-the-top character acting then brings us to the end. What an episode. This was the first important event, and they did it justice. I don't know how the show will fare moving forward. Like I said near the start, things are tight behind the scenes, but hopefully things will go smoothly enough. Of course, production has ended already, so they probably could stick to a base level of quality. I'm excited to see what the show comes up with moving forward. That's about it. Liked the video? Yes, I do record these individually every single time. Like and subscribe. Hopefully that's 5 seconds, and until next time.